Now, I have to say, and I'm with many of my scientific friends, one of the reasons they got it wrong is you didn't tell them loudly and clearly enough. There was lots of scientific information on 2 and 3 degrees because you're careful, sensible, analytical people, and you're very cautious about going beyond things that you haven't got much information on. We have to tell people, well, you have to tell people, because I just interpret what you say, very clearly and strongly just how difficult 4, 5, 6, 7 degrees centigrade are, because we face serious probabilities of going there under business as usual. And the reason that people could get to these these really ludicrous versions of economic damage for big temperature increases was simply because they extrapolated using a quadratic through 0 degrees and 2 degrees and so on. And why? Because you told them a fair amount about 2 degrees. They thought they knew something about 0 degrees by looking around them. You just fit something, and there's no way that any kind of curve fitting can pick up any kind of curvature that's relevant over a range like that. So please, and we're hearing it now, tell us loudly and strongly what's so bad about 5 degrees centigrade. And we did just hear it. Had we heard it a bit more 5 years ago, I think some of the economic story would have looked different. I tell people that 5 degrees centigrade below where we are, roughly speaking, was the last ice age very recently, 10 or 12,000 years ago, and the ice sheets came down to London and Maryland and so on. Of course, people didn't live there. They lived closer to the equator than that. And when temperature changes, you get radical change. The UK separated from the rest of Europe. Now, many people in my country think that was a rather good idea, but the point is that these are fundamentally radical changes on where people can live. The same would be true of 5 degrees centigrade upwards, as we saw just now from John. We haven't seen that for 30 to 50 million years as a world. And so we can, and you know, there were alligators at the North Pole, the world was covered in swampy forests. Again, fundamental radical change in where people can live. Hundreds of millions, probably billions of people would have to move. And we know that that would be a very extended period of conflict. We know from the history of the last 200 or 300 years that actually quite small numbers, millions of people moving, creates a very severe conflict. Hundreds of millions, billions of people moving. This is the kind of story we have to tell. Not because we're trying to frighten people, we're just being honest about where the science takes us. And that's a story that must be told. I don't want to tell the story of 5 degrees centigrade because we're going to mess this all up and we're going to have to deal with it. I want to tell the story of 5 degrees centigrade to persuade people it's a very bad idea to go anywhere near. And that's why we have to tell it so loudly and clearly. We know under business as usual, we start at upwards of 430 degrees parts per million CO2 equivalent. We're adding 2.5 a year parts per million. That's rising. 100 years of doing not very much takes us to 750, 800 parts per million, and that takes us into higher than 50% probability of 5 degrees centigrade. This is not a black swan. This is not a small probability of a rather unattractive outcome. This is a big probability of a devastating outcome, and that's what we have to get across much more clearly, I think, than we have done, although, as you heard, particularly today, that discussion is moving strongly. Now, where does the economic policy story go on the basis of that? Well, we know that for 1 or 2% of GDP, we can hold concentrations below 500 parts per million CO2 equivalent, and we can start bringing it on down from there, with difficulty, but we can. And I think most people, given the kind of insurance statement I've just made, do you want a probability of 50% of going above 5 degrees centigrade, or do you realise that just by expenditure of 1 or 2% of GDP, we could bring that probability right down to 2 or 3%? If people understand the consequences of 5 degrees centigrade, and 4 degrees, and 6 degrees, and 3 degrees and so on, then I think they can get their head around that kind of insurance proposition and say, yes, that sounds like a good deal to me. So we can make, on the basis of the kind of description I'm asking for from you, we can make a very powerful insurance case for this. We can do formal modelling of the cost of inaction, and we did that in the Stern Review. Looking back, I think we underestimated the damages for the familiar reasons. We underestimated damages in the Stern Review because emissions are growing faster than were thought. The absorption capacity of the planet is less than we thought. The probability of high temperatures from a given level of concentration is probably higher than we thought, and some of the effects are coming through faster than we thought. All reasons which you as scientists have been explaining to us, and looking back, we underestimated. But the basic insurance story, would you pay 1 or 2% of GDP for this kind of risk reduction? Thinking about the costs of inaction, look how big they would be. You can avoid these for quite a small insurance payment. I think people will understand and have understood that kind of argument. So I think we can convince people, and you have been convincing people, on the necessary scale of action. And we have got into the system at least 50% reductions by 2050. John told us that that is, of course, very unambitious in relation to the scale of the problem, but it's probably quite ambitious in relation to the scale of the challenge of bringing people with us. But at least 50% reductions to the world by 2050, I think, has been well established, and there's good economic reasons for that. So we know what kind of scale, at a minimum, we ought to be going for. We know the kinds of things we have to do in terms of energy efficiency, alternative energy sources, and in terms of stopping deforestation. We know the kinds of economic policies that we should be following. A price of carbon can be carbon trading, which has many advantages of much greater quantity certainty than tax would give you. It allows funds to flow across borders in a way that couldn't happen in a reliable way through taxes. It allows adjustment processes with varying paces of movement to auctioning permits and so on. There are quite a lot of advantages of a cap and trade scheme, and there are quite a lot of advantages of a tax scheme too. But don't let anybody kid you that it's unambiguous that economics says that tax is better than carbon trading. I've just given you 3 economic reasons why not, and it's very important to lay out the pros and cons. So we know the tax or carbon trading tools and the regulatory tools. We know that we have to give direct support for technology for all sorts of economic reasons about externalities in ideas and publicness in ideas, and we know that people's behaviour will be influenced by a discussion, and Diana brought out that very clearly, by a discussion of the issue. So it's not just the sticks and carrots of the incentive structures beloved of us economists. Forget about the incentive structures at your peril, but do not rely only on them. So we know roughly the kind of economic instruments that would incentivize the kinds of actions which would deliver results on the scale that we're talking about. We can do it. So what is left? It's political will. And let me spend the last few minutes that are available to me on putting that political will together, because this is the place, as you know still better than I do, that we will have to put that political will together. Now, at least 50% cuts, that would mean something just over 2 tonnes per capita as a world average. If you take the 20 gigatons roughly that would give as a flow, divide by the 9 billion in the world, remember that giga and billion are the same, and 20 divided by 9 is just above 2 tonnes per capita. So that's roughly where we need to be. There won't be that many people below 2 tonnes per capita, so there can't be that many people above 2 tonnes per capita. Now, you can't have all the children above average, and 2 tonnes per capita, if that's the average, there are not many people below, there can't be many people above. That's not the same as saying everybody has a right to emit 2 tonnes per capita. In my view, the rich countries have naught for a very long time as their right, given the past history. This isn't just a question of equity over flows, this is also a question of equity over stocks. So don't confuse the argument that we're going to all need to be around 2 tonnes per capita by 2050 with the argument that that's what the quota should be. The first one follows really from the arithmetic, the second one is, I think, unjustifiable as an ethical position given the past history. So we have to make that distinction quite strongly.